CTV these days is usually just as bad as Trudeau's CBC state broadcaster, and for the same reason, they are rented by Trudeau with massive subsidies and payments. In some ways, it's worse when a company like CTV takes money from Trudeau because, like I say, they're renting CTV, not buying them like the CBC. CBC can count on government money year after year. It's like they're married, whereas CTV is just dating Trudeau. They've got to answer that old question, what have you done for me lately, all the time. That said, they have a reporter named Vassy Kapelos who does some good interviews from time to time. I got to give her credit. And here she is interviewing Marc Miller, the nepotism hire, one of many in Trudeau's cabinet. He usually hires people for demographic tokenism. Remember when he hired, of course, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the first Indigenous Justice Minister. He likes to hire people like a Noah's Ark of diversity. He breaks that rule when it comes to his own wedding party. You can see in this image here, there's Seamus O'Regan, Dominique LeBlanc, Marc Miller, Gerald Butts, all of his friends from a privileged, rich, white, old stock Canadian background. Normally he hates those things except for when it's his people. Anyway, Marc Miller is one of those people who, if it weren't for his good luck in being part of Trudeau's wedding party, would never have been put into cabinet. He's just too stupid to have earned that position on his own. I mean, now that Seamus O'Regan is gone, the average IQ of that cabinet has jumped, but it's still pretty awful. Of course, it must be said that no cabinet ministers in the government have any real say. I mean, quite often they just read anything put in front of them like Yara Sachs. I think Chrystia Freeland actually does handle files or delegates them to smarter people. She, I think, actually is, in many ways, the de facto prime minister. But Marc Miller, at the very least, is trotted out to do interviews. And this interview he did with Vassy Kapelos over the last couple of days was just a disaster. And I'd like to play for you some clips and give you my thoughts. I'm not going to play the whole thing. It's about 10 minutes long, but I'll play most of it. Here, let's take a look.
I am joined now live by Immigration Minister Marc Miller. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Vassy.
I want to start off and ask you what the objective of these changes are, particularly with the temporary foreign worker program. Is it, for example, to address remarkably low youth employment rates? Is it more broad than that? Like, when this is fully realized, what is the goal?
Well, it is broader than that. We've seen recent youth unemployment rates jump. Earlier on this year, I announced the reduction of temporary workers in this country from 7% to 5%. What that looks like is a lot different than just temporary foreign workers. Temporary foreign workers are a very small part of that pie chart. International students.
Now, right off the bat, he gets something wrong. If I heard her correctly, Vassy Kapelos talks about the youth employment rate. Now, do you know the difference between an employment rate and an unemployment rate? It's a little bit tricky. Everyone knows what the unemployment rate means. It's of those people who are in the workforce, how many can't find jobs. So that's unemployment, and it might be 10% or 6% or whatever the number is. It's always higher for young people, but I don't think that's what she asked. That's the unemployment rate. That's people in the workforce who are looking for work but can't find it. What she asked about is the falling employment rate. That means people just not even trying to get a job. They're not even looking. They're not going to bother. The youth employment rate has fallen. The labor force, young Canadians, have stopped even trying to get jobs. It's actually astonishing how quickly the employment rate has fallen. So of the group that's looking for work, the number who can find work is shrinking, but the number who are even looking are shrinking. I don't actually think Marc Miller knows what the employment rate is, and I'm not showing off or anything. I just happen to know the difference. I don't think Marc Miller does. I think, like so many other cabinet ministers, he just reads what's put in front of him. I don't know if you saw this clip from, this clip from Melanie Joly the other day, who was, her hands were out and she was, and she used the phrase supply chain. And boy, if I had been there, I would have said, can you give me a simple definition of the word supply chain? Because I don't think she knows what it means, but she sort of likes saying it. Here's Melanie Joly talking about supply chains. I got to get me a few of those supply chains. Take a look.
To talk about different issues that are important to Canadians, including, of course, what is happening in the world. We know that a lot of the geopolitical instability is causing a lot of anxiety with Canadians. And also we know that affordability issues are linked to the fact that there are so many supply chains that have been disrupted because there are so many geopolitical tensions. And we saw it again today with what happened in Kyiv and across Ukraine. And of course we condemn these attacks by Russia. And at the same time, we saw it yesterday with the Hezbollah attack on Israel, and Israel standing to protect its own security.
Yeah, Marc Miller is, I don't know, I think he's about the same skill level as Melanie Joly, which is a devastating insult. All right, back to the conversation between Vassy Kapelos and Marc Miller. Take a look.
The postgraduate work permits that come with them, the humanitarian efforts that we've deployed to welcome Ukrainians here, they all form part of that category. So you can't just send people back to Ukraine and say this is all solved. We have to actually do this in a surgical way that makes sense for Canadians, but also makes sense for the economy.
Yeah, no, this is not about Ukrainians, and we all know it. It is a fact that many countries around the world took Ukrainians at the beginning of the war. We even saw some of that in Ireland when we went to see. Now, the Ukrainians actually have fit in fairly well in most cases where they've been welcomed as refugees. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, people don't feel that they're being ripped off in a deep way when you have someone coming from an actual war zone. I don't think anyone would say, what war in Ukraine? I think we all know. There are some questions about why any men would leave. Shouldn't you stay and fight for your country? But in the cases of families, I think people understand. Ukrainians, many of them do speak English, but even if they don't, there is some cultural similarity. Someone coming from Europe that maybe someone coming from, say, Somalia or another place doesn't have. So Marc Miller was playing the Ukrainian card. It was sort of his way of saying, if you don't accept refugees, well, surely you're a racist. But no. The Ukrainians have not made up large numbers of refugees in Canada for a long time. If you look at this chart of this year, the number one source of refugees, I'm not talking about student visas or temporary foreign workers, the number one source is from India. India? India's not in a war that I know of. It's not a civil war that I know of. It has some civil liberties. It's the world's largest democracy. I don't think I would want to visit, I wouldn't want to live there myself. But you cannot say that India is a place that has refugees. And if you do, get ready for literally the world's largest population, 1.4 billion. Same thing with Bangladesh. Same thing with the other top countries on that list there. Nigeria. Mexico is not a place from which refugees come in a good faith way. And here's my point. You can have your opinions about the war in Ukraine and Russia, and you can have your opinions about men leaving a war zone to come live a relatively easy life in Canada. And I think there's arguments both ways. But I don't think anyone feels ripped off. No one feels like you're lying if you come from Ukraine and say, I'm a refugee. Yeah, we know. But what is your excuse when you come from Mexico, from India? And that's why people are furious, because we all see it. We know they're ripping us off. They know they're ripping us off. They know that we know. We know that they know. And we're supposed to go along with this. And the only idiot who does is Marc Miller. Okay, play the next clip.
In the temporary foreign worker space, people working in the agricultural sector, transformation in Tim Hortons, we've seen an overheating that needs to be adjusted ever since the end of COVID. And that's something I think every Canadian expects us to do. Those numbers do affect affordability, and not all those people can become permanent residents. So the announcements that we made today, that Minister Boissonnault made today, are sort of a smart reflection of what we need to do to ramp that down back to what looks like pre-pandemic levels.
Yeah, blaming COVID as the reason for high immigration, it makes no sense in any means. I mean, first of all, during COVID, we had mass unemployment. We didn't need more people. And the idea of bringing people, moving people around the world, that seemed to go against the COVID narrative. But even if COVID had something to do with this, and I'm not sure what it does, I think a lot of people were unemployed during COVID, and we have to sop them up again. Why we would bring in foreigners to do that makes no sense. But it's almost 2025. We're in the home stretch of 2024. And blaming COVID is such a lame excuse. Only a liberal could think it up. Here's some more of this conversation that seems to be going off the rails. Take a look.
Why the undoing didn't start earlier? Because, for example, if you look at temporary residents who hold work permits, that number has increased by 150% over 2 years. It was 60%, not just low wage. I'm speaking more broadly. It was up 60% last July, year over year. Why did your government wait until just this January to start addressing one stream of it and now to address the rest of it? And could you not have addressed things earlier in order to mitigate some of the issues your Canadians are now dealing with?
I'd say 2020 hindsight is always something we can indulge in. As a thoughtful government, you always have to reflect on what you could have done faster, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. I'd simply say this, the labor shortages that we saw even a year ago are no longer there. Markets are contracting, labor markets are contracting, and there's no longer the needs for the people that we were bringing in those amounts to be here or to come to Canada. That's just reality, and I think everyone expects governments to adjust.
But did the need exist a year ago? Are you asserting that it did?
It's very possible in some areas it did. I think now it's quite obvious that we do have to adjust.
Yeah, he keeps coming back to an economic argument about how economically wonderful mass immigration is. But do you think for a second that he's blind to what he's actually doing, the political ramifications of bringing in 2 million people a year, the social and cultural ramifications? He's doing that on purpose. Now, it is technically true that if you add someone to the Canadian economy, even if you add an unemployed, illiterate person to the country, you do increase the GDP because someone has to house him, feed him, clothe him. If he gets into a trouble with the law, the criminal justice system has to deploy. The welfare system may have to deploy. So it is true, no matter who you bring to this country, whatever their skill level or however troublesome they are, yeah, you're going to get that GDP growing by a little bit. But it's going to make us all poorer in the mean. And that's what's happened, is to juice the economy. They brought in more and more people to hide the fact that we're actually getting poor individually. You can grow the size of the pie, so to speak, by adding more people. But every slice that belongs to us here gets smaller. We are getting poor on a per capita basis. Every individual in Canada on an average basis is getting poorer. And they're just bringing in mass immigration to try and hide that. Here, watch a little more.
That's just reality. And I think everyone expects governments to adjust.
But did the need exist a year ago? Are you asserting that it did?
It's very possible in some areas it did. I think now it's quite obvious that we do have to adjust. As a minister, I have a responsibility to look forward and figure out what we need to do next to make sure that we have a number of temporary workers here that make sense for addressing affordability, for addressing the needs. But there's also the risk of over-adjusting and damaging the economy. The International Monetary Fund has said quite clearly that immigration has been a huge fuel in making sure that we didn't plunge into a recession like other countries in our situation. And there has been some benefits that the Bank of Canada has clearly highlighted, with some challenges that have come with it, in and around housing, in and around affordability. And Canadians, as we've heard quite clearly over the course of the last year, have asked us to make some adjustments, and that's what we're doing. And we're doing, I think, so in a thoughtful fashion. And
I do respect the fact that you're talking about, you don't want to overshoot, essentially, that not everything is static.
He really has that liberal skill. In Orwell, it was called duck speaking, just blah, 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 like a duck, quack, 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 quack. Duck speaking is an insult in Orwell, but it's also a great compliment. Oh, he's a great duck speaker. It's my point from before. Total GDP is growing, but it makes us all poorer. And I don't know how anyone can dispute this, given just the basics of supply and demand. If you bring in 2 million more people a year, rents go up, wages go down, and we see what happens in the youth employment rate. Young people just simply don't go out and get that first job. They don't even try. How many people had their first job in fast food? I know I did. I worked at Callaway Park near my hometown of Calgary, working, scooping ice cream, working cotton candy, absolute minimum wage jobs. But that's the first rung on the ladder. You learn how to show up on time. You learn how to obey a boss. You learn how to deal with customers who are a bit of a pain in the neck without showing it. That first job, although it doesn't pay a lot, it teaches you things to be ready for the second job, the next rung on the ladder. You can't really get to the next rung if the first rung is cut off, because 2 million people a year are ahead of you in line, because Trudeau thought he would employ India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Mexico. Here, watch some more.
It hasn't been necessarily what it was a year ago. But the Canadian press, I remember a number of months ago, reported that your predecessor received a briefing 2 years ago in which it was clearly outlined that both the temporary and permanent stream would have a salient impact on affordability. You didn't do anything. I have to challenge you on that. You didn't do anything for at least a year after that. It's like you kind of turned a blind eye. Is there a reason for that?
Well, look, I've read those memos assiduously pretty much every day. We expect the public service to give us pros, cons of what impacts any measure that we take could generate. Those are risks that we take.
You see this part? He's blaming civil servants. He's saying, I get so many memos and, I blame the memos. They're so good at throwing people under the bus, aren't they? He learned that from Trudeau and how he treated Jody Wilson-Raybould. All right, here, watch a little bit more.
And I think Canadians should see them and judge us for them. But there are also risks in not taking those decisions and not taking those plunging into a recession, a real concern that would affect all Canadians. Currently now with rising interest rates, it's obvious that we do have to make a number of adjustments that economists are looking at and expecting us to make in terms of changes.
He's saying it. He's coming right out and saying it. He's saying we would be in a recession if we didn't have mass immigration. And again, what is the definition of a recession? A recession is 2 consecutive quarters with negative growth. That means the economy is getting smaller. He admits it. He says Canada would be in a recession if they weren't just ramming through as many people as possible, thousands per day. And they're doing that because, like I say, if you bring someone to Canada, no matter how strong or how weak, you will just grow the economy because now we got to take care of somebody. But that's not making any of us richer. On a per capita basis, we've been in a recession in Canada for years. I think that's one of the reasons they're doing it, to hide it. The other is so obvious. They want to cause chaos. They want to boost their vote. They want to strengthen the pro-Hamas wing of this country. They want to change Canada forever. Here, watch a little more.
Right. And that is something that under your government has been a very specific policy measure. We're now at about 500,000 going to be. And the last time we spoke to you about this issue, you said it would stay, the latest plan showed that level staying there for the next 2 years. Can you expand on what kind of things your government is considering? Are you considering, very bluntly, a reduction in permanent immigration?
Well, Vassy, we're looking at a number of options. When I paused the levels last year, it was with an undertaking to talk to Canadians and see what those levels look like or should be. There has been significant growth, I think for good reason, in the last few years. That economic growth, again, has been indispensable in making sure that the gross domestic product of the country has grown, that the entrance into the workforce, all driven by immigration, was assured.
He talks about 500,000 permanent residents, which is a shockingly high number, but even that number is a trick because those may be the permanent residents, but there are more than 1 million students here on a visa, but they're taking fake degrees and they're not going home when they're done. And then there's 750,000 people who are here as temporary foreign workers, but no one makes sure they leave afterward. There's no deportations in this country. When was the last time you've heard of a deportation? So yeah, on the books, we have 500,000 people a year coming to this country, which is a shocking record number. But it's actually quadruple that. Our population has grown 2 million people in the last year. You can watch a little more.
Why is that the conversation happening right now? And I ask with respect specifically to permanent, because every interview I've conducted with you or the housing minister over the last year, you have been very insistent that what was driving the ills associated with immigration was on the temporary side of things. And I even remember in January asking you this question about the permanent stream, and you said like questions in that, you were kind of hearing a lot of questions in that area, and some of them had undertones of racism. Like that is the way that your government pushed back against questions about permanent residency. And now, at one of the most politically vulnerable times for your party, you're willing to look at cutting those numbers. Is that why? Well,
no, look, I'm not going to presume that racism doesn't exist, but there are legitimate views within Canadian society of people I would never think of calling.
Yeah, the word racist comes up, but, both CTV and the Liberal government call people racist who have objected to immigration. I'm glad Vassy Kapelos has put in this question to Marc Miller because he's absolutely been disgusting about it, but CTV is no better. They call anyone who disagrees with mass immigration as racist. But look here, this is an amazing headline. The Premier of Quebec said that if they sent home all of Trudeau's foreign workers, 300,000 people from Quebec, immediately would solve the housing crisis. And how could you possibly dispute that?
Donc seulement 2 ans, on est passé de 300 000 immigrants temporaires à 600 000 immigrants temporaires. Donc, on voit donc une réelle explosion du nombre d'immigrants temporaires. C'est pas rien, là, en 2 ans, ajouter 300 000 immigrants. Ça met une pression énorme sur les services publics, que ce soit en éducation, en santé ou tous les services publics. Ça met une pression énorme sur le logement. Faites un petit calcul, là, 300 000 personnes de plus en 2 ans, c'est plus de 100 000 logements. On n'est pas capable de construire 100 000 logements. Si demain matin, ces 300 000 personnes-là n'étaient pas là, il n'y en aurait pas de crise du logement. Je le répète, là, puis je sais qu'il y en a que ça les choque quand je dis ça, là, mais c'est factuel.
If you took out 300,000 people from the housing market in Quebec, not only would those 300,000 homes be available, but it would reduce pressure for everyone. It wouldn't just be 300,000 people could find homes. It's that the prices for everyone else would subside. Take in a little bit more. Take a look.
Your government have been more entertaining to those views previously?
Well, I think we should always be open to these points of views. The conversations that I have, for example, around the Easter table, Christmas table, they're different views. Some people have a different view on immigration than I do. This is a country that has largely benefited and built an amazing consensus around immigration. But again, we're hearing from different parts of Canada, different even people in my own family that have different views on immigration. I think we owe it as a responsible government to listen to them, even if we don't.
He talks about even my own family. Yeah. Well, I guess a few months ago he would have said even my own family has racists, because I guess now that some liberals are admitting immigration is too high, they're going to stop calling people racist. Yeah. Don't count on it. They'll call you racist forever. Sexist, transphobe, whatever they want, alt-right. They'll call you anything to avoid dealing with the issues. Keep watching.
Where can we best rationalize things? Where can we have a sustainable level within the levels that we see with the other countries of the OECD? And have a conversation that's devoid of racism, but also reflective of what different people are thinking. Both people from diasporas that we've brought in, but also Canadians that have been here perhaps a little longer. And I think that is that's what Canadians expect.
What does that even mean, to have a conversation devoid of racism? So he's saying, all right, I'm going to allow you to talk about immigration now, but only if you don't get all racist-y on me. By which he means you can't question why we're receiving refugees from India. You can't question why we're essentially letting these fake diploma mills, Acumen Academy, to sell. They're basically selling immigration for 10 or 20 grand in tuition. They're not learning anything. They're not teaching anything. They're just calling people students to bring them over here. There's 1 million people like that. There are 1 million people in Canada who are here from foreign countries to study at fake schools. That's more than there are Canadians in university, just so you know. You're not allowed to talk about that because that's a little too racisty. I liked watching this interview. I think it's about 9 years too late. Frankly, these questions should have been put to the Harper Conservatives beforehand, but they were terrified of being called racist. I'm glad to see this interview. I'm a little surprised to see it on CTV. Don't let them get away with suddenly retracting the insults they've made against you for saying these things for years.